Welcome back everyone to this lecture series on timestamps and extract functionality. In part 1, we're going to focus on displaying current time information. So as I just mentioned, in this lecture, we're going to be going over a few commands and functions that report back time and date information. Something to keep in mind is that these functions will be more useful when we're creating our own tables and databases rather than when we're just querying a database. We're going to be learning about creating our own tables and databases later on in the course, but it makes sense to learn about a few commands and data types right now. So we've already seen in our tables that PostgreSQL can hold date and time information. For example, we saw that timestamp data type column for things like when a customer actually rented a DVD. Now keep in mind, there's actually different subsets of data types that refer to things like storing time information or date information. And the four main ones are the time data type, which contains only time, such as hours, minutes, and seconds. Then there's the date data type, which contains only a date, the month, day, and year. And then there's timestamp, which essentially combines both of those and contains both date information and time information. And then there's timestamp TZ, or timestamp time zone, which contains date, time, and time zone information. Something to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this later on when we're learning about creating our own tables and databases, is you should have or perform careful considerations when designing a table and database and choosing a time data type. Keep in mind, depending on the situation, you may or may not need the full level of dates, times, and time zones. For example, if you're designing a table that will calculate how many hours people worked, you may actually just need time information, the time they clocked in and then the time they clocked out, especially if each row represents a work shift. There's no point in keeping track of time zone because you don't expect this person to be changing time zones in one shift of work. Now, something to critically remember is if you are keeping track of historical time information or date information or timestamp information, and you're trying to perform some sort of calculation, like maybe how many days were worked or something of that nature, you can always remove historical information. For example, if you're keeping track of timestamp TZ, and later on you discover you don't actually need time zone information, you can always remove that time zone information. But what you cannot do is go back and add it in because you were never recording it in the first place. So that's really the careful consideration to make, is that if you're recording time or date information, and you decide later on that you wanted to go back and also record time zone information because maybe your company expanded globally, you can't actually just make that information pop out of nowhere. So you should always have that careful consideration and try to think long term when choosing a particular time data type. Now, with that being said, I want to just quickly explore a couple of functions and operations related to these specific data types, and those are time zone, now, time of day, current time, and current date. And as I mentioned, these are more useful when we're creating tables or having a table automatically populate entries based off when something is actually created, like what time is this row actually being created. So we're going to quickly go over these, and don't expect them to be super useful for queries, but later on we'll encounter some of these functions. They're pretty self-explanatory, so I'm just going to head straight to pgadmin and work through a few examples. Okay, here I am in PostgreSQL, and I've connected to my DVD rental database. Now let's first show you how to actually understand and grab what is your current time zone that you're working in. And the way we do that is with the show command. And we haven't actually seen this before. Keep in mind, I'm not going to do select, I'm going to do show. And the main command people can use with show is show all. And if you check out the documentation for PostgreSQL on show, it shows the values of a bunch of runtime parameters. And there's a list of parameters here, and you can scroll down and view more information on them. But if you just say show all and then run this query, I'll go ahead and run that, you'll notice there's a name of a parameter, the setting it's currently on, and then a description text basically telling you and explaining what that name and setting refer to. So for example, my current application is pgadmin4, and if I keep expanding on this, it'll tell me what actual connection I'm on. And if you scroll down, there's actually about 300 different parameters you can see here. And so one of them you can check out quickly is time zone. Go ahead and run that, and you can see here that on the computer I'm working on, that my current time zone is US Eastern. Okay, so that's how you can figure out what time zone you're working with. Now, if you actually want to get the current timestamp, and recall timestamp includes both date and time information, here we come back and we'll say select, and then we're going to call the now function. So it's now open and close parentheses, which basically just says, give me the timestamp information for right now. And once you run that, you'll be able to see that you get a timestamp with a time zone set of information. So you can see the date and then the time, as well as information concerning what actual time zone you're in based off standard GMT, which stands for Greenwich Mean Time, and you can just do a quick Google search on that, which is basically just an international way of marking what time zone you're in. So you can use select now to get your current timestamp. One thing to notice is that this gives it to you in kind of timestamp format, which is sometimes a little hard to read. If you want it as a string, you can say select time of day, open and close parentheses, run that, and this returns back basically the same information, but as a string, labeling it Thursday, March 19th, and then time, and then the year, as well as the time zone. So a little easier to read and possibly a little easier to store and grab components from, because it's just a text string with that information. It's actually no longer a specific timestamp style. And then finally, the last two commands are basically subsets of this. Instead of grabbing the current timestamp, you can just grab just the current time, which would be select current time, run that. That gives you just the time with time zone, or you could change it to current date, run that, and that basically just gives you the current date. Okay, so now we know how to grab the time zone information, the full timestamp with now functionality, and then how to grab the time of day, which is this string representation of the timestamp that it currently is, and then how to grab current dates and current time subcomponents of that. This will be a lot more important when we're creating different rows in our tables and then trying to log stuff of when it was actually created. We won't typically be asking for what the current date is with SQL just like this. Instead, just use your clock. Okay, so coming up next, we're going to focus on timestamp functionality that's related to querying tables and databases. So I will see you there in the next lecture.